get their projects underway. We're always looking for new project ideas, so if you have any, send them over. I know that on this webinar, a lot of you are work group members, so you know the situation. But if not, go ahead and I'll put the RSDP website up as well. You can find out more about it. This series, this is the first one of the series, so thank you for your patience as we kind of get it figured out. But this series is meant to connect our work group members with the university resources, like Anne, and then also feature projects that we are helping to support, like Kevin's project with the Zumbro Watershed Education Sites. So tune in. Our next one will be in 2 weeks. I'll tell you more about that at the end, but let's go ahead and get started. Anne, I will do a quick introduction. So Anne Lewandowski is a research associate from the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, where she coordinates research, training, and outreach projects related to agriculture and water quality. And she leads the Watershed Specialist Training Program for local water resource professionals, and I think we'll be hearing a little bit more about that today. So go ahead, Anne, take it away.
Great, thank you, Rose. As Rose said, I'm with the Water Resources Center, and I wanted to first mention our director, our new director, Jeffrey Peterson, who just started last August, and he wanted to send his greetings to y'all, and he's got a conflict, so couldn't join this morning, but wanted to make sure the lines were open, that you felt welcome to contact him and the Water Resources Center. And also there's my name and contact information, and we can share that again later as we go. Just a little background. I want to introduce you to the Water Resources Center and who we are and what we do, and that goes back to 1964, if you're going to talk about our history, in the Federal Water Resources Research Act, which created one Water Resources Research and Technology Institute in each state. And so this is what we're one of, every state has a center like this, and the purpose of these centers is to plan, conduct or otherwise arrange for competent, applied, and peer-reviewed research in the field of water supply and training future professionals and so on. So are there still audio issues? Do we need to address something? Or? Okay.
And you can go ahead and I'll work with people on the chat.
Okay. And okay. And then the Water Resource Center history. So that Water Resources Research Center was created in 1965. The Water Resource Sciences graduate program was created in the mid-1990s. And then the Water Resources Center, as it exists now, was a combination of that original Water Resources Research Center created in '65, and it combined with another group here on campus. So we were renamed at that time in the mid-90s. So we go back a ways at the university, and what we have right now is research, teaching, and outreach are made like the rest of the university. We try to work in all three of those mission areas. In the area of research, we have a small research grant competition that we run each year in the fall, and that's for researchers. So it's not necessarily relevant to some of what you're doing, except that it's the research awards are given. It's important that they be relevant to Minnesota needs, and so they often make connections to people around the state. So sometimes you might be able to make a connection to those grants. But even more significantly, we facilitate a lot of projects around campus and find grant funding and so on to work with researchers around campus on water projects. So we're always doing a lot of partnerships. In the area of teaching and learning, we have this Water Resources Science graduate program, and and that's an interdisciplinary program where students can work with people from a lot of different programs. But then we also have these professional training programs, and I'm going to tell you about the Watershed Specialist Training Program shortly, but we also have the on-site sewage treatment program, which is for professionals who install septic systems and so on, and then there's the wetland delineation program for people who do, for various legal reasons, need to draw the boundaries around a wetland, and so we run that training program as well. And there's a whole variety of ways that we reach out to people around the state and do public service. We have our big water resources conference in October, and there's a number of other events that we don't necessarily host but are very active in, such as the Climate Change Adaptation Conference that just happened last month, and there's a urban or stormwater conference that happens in September, and a number of other events. And we're involved in various policy boards such as the Clean Water Council and the Bowser, and I'm on the Drainage Management team and so on. And my point of saying all of this is we're pretty well connected to the state agencies, and we're connected to the researchers around the university. So if you're looking for a starting point of how do we find the right people working in this area, contact us, and we're not necessarily doing the work ourselves, but I'm pretty sure we can help you find the right people to connect with whatever expertise, or we can give you funding ideas or whatever it might be. Hopefully we can get you moving in the right direction. So let me tell you about this Watershed Specialist Training Program, which I've been involved with since it was created. It's really, it's a training program aimed at the local water professionals around the state, the Soil and Water Conservation District staff, watershed districts, county environmental services division staff, city staff, and so on. All these people around the state that deal with water projects at a local level. You know, these are the people who are doing the work. There's probably 700 or 800 staff around the state in all of these entities, and that's our main target audience. So it's not necessarily the people necessarily on the board or yourself that might want to take this, but I would encourage you to make sure that the people around you are aware of this as an opportunity. When we were creating this program, we were asking questions about what are the competencies that people, these local staff, need to do their job, and what are the characteristics of those staff who are especially effective. And we talked a lot to the people in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana who already had programs, related programs like this, and got ideas from them as well, because they've been asking these questions for a while. And when we looked at this, what are the competencies that local staff really need to do their job? I mean, think about what they're doing. They have to understand the policy that and all the different entities, from the federal agencies to the state agencies to the local rules and so on that relate to water. They have to understand the science of water. They have to understand how do you do community engagement and work with and empower the community to address water issues. They need to understand just administration. How do you write a work plan and administer a project like this? How do you prioritize the different activities and so on? So there's just, they're really have a lot of skills that they need to pull together to make this stuff happen. And when we looked at what are these skills they need and what are the ones that really stand out for effective leaders, the ones that stood out for the people who really get things done are they have the good communication skills, they have the management and leadership skills, They're good at collaboration and networking and partnering, and they're good at integrating all of this stuff. They don't get into their silo of, oh, I know my particular science field that I was trained in, or they don't get stuck in the policy side of it or whatever. They're able to integrate all of those. And that ability to integrate all that stuff is what we're trying to capture in this training program. So, and I don't want to diminish the technical side of it. You notice there weren't any technical topics on that list. We assume the technical sciences are a basic understanding that you have to have. That's essential. But for the people to really be effective, they have to have these human dimension skills. And so that's really what we focus on in this training. We go through the policies and the institutions and rules and whatever. What is it you need to know there? What's some of the watershed science and the integration of science across a watershed that you need to know? How do you assess and evaluate and monitor water as well as the people? How do you assess the community you're working with? So those are topics that are all important in understanding the context that you're doing water resource work in. But then how do you build systems that support clean water? So we have a module on civic engagement that's quite popular, and it's fun to hear the comments that people come back with about just the light bulbs going off with, if you're going to engage with people, this isn't a matter of just having a meeting and presenting information. You actually have to involve them in the decision making if you're going to come up with effective solutions. So what does that mean? So that's a really fun module for us. We have another module on implementation activities. How do you compare, if you've got a problem, there's a lot of ways to go at it. You can make new rules, you can do cost share on land management practices, you can do education and outreach kinds of activities. There's a lot of different things you can do. How do you compare them and figure out what's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck to actually improve our water quality? And we have a module on project administration, as I said, writing work plans for either grants or whatever it might be. And then we have a communication module, which cuts across everything, and you all understand, I'm sure, how important good, effective communication and strategic communication is to making things happen. That is the topics that we're talking about. It's a 14-week online course. It's entirely online. We get some really good discussions going on online, which I really enjoy. Some people are really hesitant about how can you get into these kind of complex topics online, and it actually works quite well because the discussions are, people can take their time in having thoughtful responses to the discussion in a way that you don't necessarily get into it in person. So it's, it's got drawbacks, but we do find it very effective. Participants come away with a certificate of completion. The exercises that we ask them to do and the assignments, we try to make them as relevant as possible. They can pull them out of their work activities. They get a lot of feedback from their peers, from instructors and mentors and so on, and they develop valuable contacts and resources. That's a big thing they get out of it. So that's the course and how we run it. It runs twice a year following the university's fall and spring semester schedules, so starting in early September, and then the spring session starts in mid-January. We're about halfway through it right now. If you find anybody that's interested, send them to this URL, this wst.umn.edu. So that'll get you there. So let's see. I think I'll just keep going and we'll take questions at the end. I think that'll be be best is the second thing I wanted to tell you about is this new publication that's come out that the Water Resources Center coordinated. It's called Fields to Streams, and when I say coordinated, there is a long list of authors and contributors and reviewers involved in this, and a lot of expertise that went into it. And the current, printing just is hot off the press as of Monday, and that was funded in part by the Freshwater Society and ISG, which is an engineering firm in Mankato. The development of it was funded by the McKnight Foundation. The origin of this book is, as I've said, we talk to a lot of people around the state, and water is complex, and we all have a really hard time explaining a lot of the concepts around it. And we saw there were a lot of misunderstandings about how water flows through the landscape and what are the key features that make the difference in our pollution issues and so on. So we wanted to talk about the fundamentals. What are those critical concepts that the public and all the people working in this need to understand? And could we write some of this language straightforward and simply enough and give people some pictures to work with so that they could, so to help all of you tell this story. So we wrote this book. It's really for you, for the local conservationists, to give you some language and some pictures, so when you're talking to people around the state and in your community, how do you explain some of this stuff? That's what we were trying to do. I think I'm not going to go into a lot of the stories right now. I'm going to encourage you to take a look at the book. We've got it at that URL, that z.umn.edu/fields-to-streams, and Rose will give you those links. And it's available there, download electronically, and I think by the end of the day tomorrow, I'm hoping we'll have the link to where you can order it online as well, so to get a hard copy of it. But we talk about glaciers. Actually, let me just flip through here to the table of contents. I'm going to pause on this concept here. One of the points that we make is that evapotranspiration is 50 to 90% of precipitation. That is, of all the rain that falls on the land in your part of the state, or I guess we've got people from around the state, don't we? Okay. In the western part of the state, only 10% of the rainfall ends up as in the streams and in the ditches and so on. In the eastern part of the state, maybe 75% of it will end up, 30% of it ends up as runoff. The rest of it ends up as it evaporates or it's transpired by plants. And this is really important for managing water flow in the streams, because if you can impact evapotranspiration, you can reduce the flow in streams. So that's just an example of one of the concepts that we spend some time talking about. I'm just going to flip ahead here. These are the chapters that we talk about. Landforms, how are the glacial history of the area, what difference does that make? What's the water cycle? And that's, this evapotranspiration concept, the importance of that. The watersheds, the importance of thinking about all the land that feeds into a lake. Don't get yourself hung up on just looking at a lake. Make sure you're looking at all the land around it. Soil, how does that make a difference? Precipitation trends. We all know climate is changing. What's the important trends that we know of? What's the history of our vegetation across the state, and what difference does that make to the water cycle? And similarly, we talk about what's the history of ag drainage, and what difference does that make to the water cycle? And that's a really contentious one, as you all know, because it has a lot of implications economically and ecologically. So getting the facts straight on what we know about ag drainage and what we don't know is pretty important. So we're hoping we told that story in a way that helps clarify some of that. And then Chapter 10 on how water shapes the land. How does all of this stuff add up to changing the water flow so that our streams are changing, the shapes of our streams are changing, the flow, water flow is changing. And then finally, what are the trends in stream flow and sediment and channels and so on. And we've really focused on sediment and stream flow in this book. There is an appendix on nutrients and so on, and so you can make a connection, because there is obviously a connection. But we really, just for the sake of focus, have focused on sediment. And then Part 2 gets into the practices that we can put on the land to impact how water flows. Okay. I'm going to flip ahead here to a couple other university resources to make sure you know about. The Water Resources Center, there's our URL, and these URLs, Rose will give you all of these. University Extension has an environment page and a water page, and lots of great links there and resources there. There is an erosion and stormwater certification program that the Water Resources Center doesn't run, but that comes out of the U as well, and that's pretty valuable. For those of you in the southern part of the state, Minnesota State University Mankato has a Water Resources Center, and some folks down there doing some great things. So I better stop here and open it up to questions, and what I really want to know is, what are your topics that you're concerned about? What expertise do you need? And how can we hear from you? How can we make sure that we hear your concerns on a regular basis here at the Water Resources Center, so that we're in touch with what your needs are? And so I'll open it up, and Rose, if you can, I assume you're following the chat there, you can just tell me what people are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have one question in already from someone wondering, you mentioned about 800 soil and water conservation districts and other watershed district staff. About how many of those have taken the watershed specialist certification?
I should know that at the tip of my tongue. Let's see, we started fall 2013, 14, 15. This is our 6th session, and we've done 15 or 20 people, so over 100, 150, something like that. And when I say that 800, that's soil and water conservation districts, watershed districts, counties, cities, tribes. We've had a number of people from the tribal governments as well.
Awesome, thank you. And I just wanted to say, for my own, plug of this whole, the Fields to Streams in particular, I read it and I really loved all of your graphics. They're really helpful, and it's also written in a really comfortable way too, so the information is really accessible, even to someone who is not a watershed professional.
And that's what we're aiming for. And the other thing we're aiming for, and I thought I'd have up by now but isn't, is we want to share all of those graphics so you can use them easily. I hopefully will get that up in the form of a PowerPoint or whatever it might be, so you can grab those graphics easily and put them into whatever your presentation is. If the existing download PDF, I mean, you can lift things out of there. If that doesn't meet your needs, let me know, and I'll get you a higher resolution PDF to help you get the graphics. So let me know if you have any trouble with that.
Awesome, thanks. There's another question from Kevin, if you can see it in the chat box, about evapotranspiration. It says, it looks like farmland in western and southern Minnesota have high evapotranspiration, but we also see all streams in those regions having increased flow. Did their evapotranspiration go down?
Yes. That's a wonderful question. There has been precious little study of wetlands and water storage and so on, and what impact we could have on that. But there was one that came out from Drew Kessler and Satish Gupta last summer that they were estimating in the Gaburba, the Greater Blue Earth Basin area here, looking at all the historical wetlands and depressions and so on, and the evapotranspiration that came from those, all that standing water, there was a whole lot more ET. And they calculated the higher ET from assuming all of those wetlands were filled up with water, was it 2.5 to 5 inches of additional ET? So if you consider now across southern Minnesota, we're getting 2.5 inches of runoff up to 10 inches of runoff, something like that. And if there's potentially 2.5 to 5 inches of additional evapotranspiration that was happening from wetlands, that's a huge proportion of our existing runoff. So I don't want to take that comparison too far, but yes, our ET has changed, and the water storage, standing water in wetlands and so on could make a really huge difference in that. But also keep in mind the increased precipitation that's happened in recent decades. That's made a huge impact too on flow.
Awesome. Thank you, Anne. So I think that we might transition now to talking with Kevin Strauss from the Zumbro Watershed Partnership about their RSDP-sponsored project. So Anne, you can go ahead and pass the presenter ball over to Kevin. And I just have a little bit of an intro. So Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you guys have been working with the Southeast Region Partnership since 2012. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Awesome, cool. So we've been working with you for a while. Kevin Strauss is the education coordinator for the ZWP, and he also serves on the Southeast Natural Resources Work Group. So I'll turn it over to you, Kevin, to tell us more about the Zumbro Watershed Partnership and your project.
Okay, and how do I change the slides?
You can go
there it is.
Presentation is up at the top. LCCMR
yep.
project. Cool.
Okay, yep, all set. Great. Yeah. Thanks, Rose, for giving me a chance to talk about the project. Zumbro Watershed Partnership is a nonprofit watershed organization, which is unusual in Minnesota. We have watershed districts, which are governmental units bigger than a county that manage watersheds. And then in most of the parts of the state, there's no watershed-wide organization. There's just no one in charge of it. We're kind of in the middle there. We're a nonprofit group that tries to do what watershed districts do with none of the funding and none of the political authority. So we do a lot of voluntary programs and education programs as a way to encourage people to work for cleaner water and fewer floods. And here's a map of our watershed. The biggest city in the Zumbro watershed is the city of Rochester. Our most exciting water event recently was the 2010 floods, where the Zumbro went over its banks in quite a few places. And after that event, we realized that historically there'd been a lot of talking with landowners and farmers about land management. And that was great, and those projects are still going strong. But we realized that it can't just be rural landowners that are involved in knowing what happens with land use and rivers. And so we began looking at how do we engage a wider circle of people in conversations and discussions about clean water and what we can do to keep the rivers clean. And so we, starting in 2012, began looking at options to create something called educational recreation sites in the watershed. That would be a list of places where when you're coming to the river, you'd have a chance to learn something about the river, wildlife, and challenges of the river and what we can do to keep the river clean and safe. And we, the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership with Aaron really was sort of the place where this project sort of hatched. We got together with Aaron and some other folks and began brainstorming and came up with some ideas. And as we looked at funding sources, eventually settled on the LCCMR, Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources. And after 3 proposals finally got funded this past year to do the project. The project addressed two big problems in the watershed. One is that most watershed residents don't know a whole lot about how pollution gets to the Zumbro River and how high water events get to the Zumbro River. We've done some surveys with our residents and found out that most people think that you can only pollute the river if you're living right in the banks of the river, which was true 40 years ago. Back in 40 years ago, if there's a factory on the river, sometimes that factory would put pollution into the river. Nowadays, that isn't true. It's most of the pollution coming, as you know, in Minnesota here comes from land use all across the watershed. So we wanted to address sort of factual things people don't know yet about what's happening with our river. And we also realized that the Zumbro River doesn't have a lot of recreational amenities that make it easy for people to get up close to the river and recreate on the river in terms of canoe launches or benches or picnic tables near the water that would encourage people to spend more time near the river. In a lot of places, you hear about rivers being sort of a big amenity, that it's seen as a resource for the community. There's a lot of recreation that happens. The Root River is one good example of that just to our south. But the Zumbro, for whatever historical reason, was never quite seen that way. And so we wanted to make it easier for people to recreate on the Zumbro. And so this project sort of came together on those two goals. We, working with the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, we began contacting local communities and other contacts in the watershed, saying, we got this great idea. We want to improve recreational amenities and education all along the Zumbro River. And we asked people to send in proposals for what areas near the river. They had to be public city parks or public land of some sort so the public could visit them. And we asked people to suggest, where would you like us to do projects? And we ended up getting 22 different applications. And then a volunteer working group that involved the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, Zumbro Watershed, and a couple of other local groups went through that list of 22 sites and tried to figure out what are the highest priority, what are the best sites we can work on. We ended up finding 8 ideal sites, and they became part of the heart of the LCCMR application. In the process of getting our application approved, the LCCMR committee decided that they'd provide funding for 6 locations. And so we dropped 2 of the locations from the site, but at some point we're hoping to do a round 2, and maybe we can catch those sites up with that. But now you can see the sites we're going to be working with, Mantorville in the south, then Orinoco, which was the site of that 2010 flooding event where the dam blew out. Now the whole area is being redesigned, the dam's being removed, and it's creating a new recreation area, so we're happy to piggyback on that project. Pine Island, the Green Bridge, which is on a county road. It's our only site that isn't actually in a community, but it's a DNR canoe launch site that a lot of people use, so we thought it would be a great place to reach people going to the river. Zumbro Falls is a site where we are actually working with the city of Zumbro Falls. They had a huge impact from that 2010 flood, and the federal government bought out several property owners that had been flooded, and some of that land is being turned into a new riverside park in Zumbro Falls. So we're working in cooperation with the city to add some amenities to what they were already investing in there. And then the city of Wanamingo, where we're doing a project in a park that, like many communities in the Zumbro watershed, almost all of them had dams in the early 1900s for lakes, for swimming and recreating, and all those lakes are now gone. The dams have filled in, and the Zumbro River went around them. And so the park site we're working on there actually has a dam in it, but it doesn't hold back any water. It's just sitting in the middle of a piece of land, and so we're using that to talk about history in the area and also how the river changes and how we change the river over time. The project involves a couple of different steps, and the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership has been involved in a lot of these steps for us. They created that forum early on to help us brainstorm and decide what kind of project we wanted to do. They also provided some funding to do a proof of concept project where they looked at what we wanted to do. They connected us with the Center for Changing Landscapes, University of Minnesota location that does a lot of this sort of work of doing landscape drawings and plannings to improve landscape areas like parks. And the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership also found some funding so that we could kind of do a trial run. We developed a plan for a park in Mantorville, and then we sort of walked through the process. And then when we applied to the LCCMR, we could show them, this is what we're going to do. We already did a test run. The process works. Here are the drawings that came from that test run. And that made it a lot easier for us to convince the legislature that we knew what we were doing, because we'd already gone through the process of choosing sites and developing one location with landscape drawings. And also the partnership has been great in just making sure we're connected to university resources that we wouldn't inherently have known about on our own. And so Erin's done a great job. Erin Tegman at the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership has done a great job of connecting us up with those resources. And if we're running into a challenge, something we can't quite figure out, she's a great go-to person to help us know what to do next. Here's an example of one of the drawings, probably going to be our first site that we're building this year, Buckman's Landing in Zumbro Falls. And in the bottom left-hand part of the picture, you can see there's the Zumbro River. And this is a brand new gravel parking lot as part of the park. And the city's doing all the heavy lifting. They're putting in the gravel, they're putting in the boat launch with the DNR. And so where we are using our resources is a kiosk sort of toward the entrance here, another kiosk in sort of an overlook area, and some benches along a trail that goes around the picnic area and also down by the river. And either the city or our project might also provide picnic tables, because we figure if there are picnic tables there, it's easier for people to spend more time at the river. This project has been fun to watch, because even before we have anything on the ground, a lot of people are stopping here. They see a parking lot, it's near the river, and people in town are talking about how there's increased traffic in the area just because there's this new place to park a car. It's easier to get access to the river, which is a challenging thing in parts of the watershed. And one spin-off of this wasn't really part of our project, but for Zumbro Falls, something they really focused on here is if they can provide a good access point here. This is actually the second access point in Zumbro Falls to the river here. The other one is on a private sportsman's park across the river, but this is the first public one. It's really easy to find, and people in Zumbro Falls are looking at this as a possible spin-off for some local development, that people coming to the area to recreate spend money in local businesses. And that's been a real priority for the community, to rebuild that infrastructure and bring more people to the community. So since this project was designed to really work in partnership with communities, another piece that the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership helped us with was they've hired a contract staff person who works with me to do civic engagement. Once we had identified our locations and received our funding, we then began holding public meetings in those communities to talk with people about how they use their parks currently and what they'd like to see happen in the future. And as part of that brainstorming community engagement process, we were able to help that community develop sort of a master plan for their park. Here are all the ideas community members are thinking about. Here they are in a poster form, and here's one example of that. And it really gives folks a blueprint. We had to be really, really clear, given that our resources, pardon me, are limited. We have to only do portions of the project, but we're really happy that a secondary benefit of the project for communities is this master plan. And Mary Vogel at the Center for Changing Landscapes has talked about other projects they've done where they've developed sort of this master plan poster or design for the site, and that years afterwards, the mayor and other people in the community keep using that plan to bring more resources and development to local parks. And so we're hoping to see communities use this plan even after we're gone on their own to make their park more accessible and bring more people to the river. After we've held several community meetings to find out what they want to see happen at the park, we work with the Center for Changing Landscapes to do a site drawing, and then from that we pick certain elements that we'll be actually funding with our part of the LCCMR project. And that's where we are right now, actually. The building season starts June 1st, and so in the project right now, what we're doing is I am actually counting pieces of 2x4s that are used in the kiosk signs for the project. We have to get a list of materials together because another partner that we're able to work with in this project, with the Center for Changing Landscapes, brought in the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa, which is another organization that we had heard of but never worked with in any real capacity. But they, as we've developed the project and the grant application, they're basically our labor force. They're going to do the trail building, the sign installation, and sort of those projects that that has been a great resource for us. Being a nonprofit, we have 2 part-time staff people. We don't have the person power to install signs and benches at this scale, and so it was great that that other partner could come in and join us. Here's another example. This is the Mantorville site, which this is a second-generation coaster, and their park. Every site was different, and we sort of knew that going in. We didn't quite realize how radically different everything was. And so it's been very exciting. The Buckman's Landing, this was a brand new park. It's never been used before, and so this was a blank slate. We could propose and do all sorts of things here, and that was a wonderful experience. By comparison, the Mantorville Park is a strong community resource. They use it when we asked them, how many days out of the summer do you use this park for different events, and it was a huge chunk of the summer. And so one thing we had to think about was how do our amenities get installed in ways that reinforce what's already being done at the park and don't get in the way of how they need to use the property. And so that took some discussion between us and the community, sort of work out, where are places we can make improvements that wouldn't get in the way of things you're already doing. And this is another site that we're going to be building this summer. There are 6 sites total. We'll be doing Zumbro Falls, Mantorville, and the Green Bridge canoe launch site this year, and then the next 3 sites next year. And it's been the process that we're moving through here. It's has been really good in lots of ways. The biggest benefit of it, I think, is connections with rural communities. We do education programming in lots of places in the watershed, about a 1 million acre watershed, but we haven't really done these sort of long-term extended projects in areas where, outside of Rochester. We've done some projects to install signs on bridges all around the watershed so people know what stream or river they're crossing around the Zumbro, but those were projects where we didn't really interact a lot with community members. And this has been a great project for us in just making those local connections with people. So when people hear Zumbro Watershed Partnership, they got an idea of who we are and what we do, and that they can take an active role in things like clean water and flood prevention. And so that's been a great benefit for us. Oh, and here's the project schedule. I didn't know that was on the slides. So here it is. You can see the different locations. Several of these projects are, ideally, they've been sort of piggybacking on other things that are happening, which has been great. It's given us a much bigger bang for the LCCMR dollars we have, because there was already parts of a project going together, but often in the case of Orinoco, they wanted to do some education and outreach and put in a trail as part of their Lake Shady restoration project, but it turned out that the funds they had available only would fund the work right on the river, not any of the educational pieces of the project, which turned out to be great for us, that they had already done their designs and planning, and we could sort of step in and provide some resources on a location that a lot of people use to help educate people about cleaner water and fewer floods and what we can do to get there. So that's kind of the crash course in the project, and I saw a couple of questions come zooming by. So this would probably be a good time to open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. That's really awesome. And yeah, as Linda mentioned in the chat box, I'm also an individual placement member with the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa. So it's cool to hear that that the people on the ground are the ones doing these projects.
Yeah, that's great. I see a question about the advantages and disadvantages of a nonprofit partnership versus a watershed district. Yes. And that's the debate we have, I think, weekly at Zumbro Watershed. Generally speaking, I don't think, if there's going to be a watershed organization, usually the people that are involved in putting it together have a leaning one way or the other. It just turned out, let's see, we just had our 10th anniversary last year. So 11 years ago, folks in this region looked at the flooding and runoff and pollution problems we were encountering here, and they sort of looked at those two options. They said, okay, there's sort of the government route with watershed district, and there's the nonprofit route with the partnership. And most areas could probably go either direction. There is some legal paperwork. There are some steps to go through to develop a watershed district, but they do get formed. They're most common in the Twin Cities metro area. They're seen as sort of an urban approach to watershed management. In rural areas, they're less common, and some folks say that's because in rural areas, people don't want to see another level of government. I'm not sure that's true. They just created a watershed district in Mower County west of here, and it seemed to work just fine. One thing that our board then, and still our board today, talks about is that they like the citizen involvement in the project, that it's local people from the area coming together to talk about and look for solutions on pollution and flooding issues. And so that's really been a benefit on our end. Talking to coworkers and people that work in at a watershed district level, watershed districts are a governmental agency. They have taxing authority. They have regulatory authority. And so for some people, they look at that and they say, well, if you have secure funding because you have taxing authority and you can set regulations to clean up pollution problems, that's a perfect storm there. That should be easy to solve issues like that. And in places where they've been formed, a lot of folks have good things to say about them. Usually they're formed in areas that have had flooding events or something very serious that had to be resolved. And so the other place you see them in Minnesota is the Red River of the North, where they've had flooding problems up there. And watershed districts seem to be the entity that works well to solve those problems. Let's see. Examples of the kind of education activities Zumbro River Watershed Partnership has historically done. Any example of how it has changed and increased public engagement? Education programs that we do, let's see, I've been working with Zumbro Watershed since 2010, so just the last 5 years. We do a couple of different things. We do education programs in local communities. Usually it ends up being library programs where we have slide programs, 30-minute slide programs about the history of the watershed, some of the basic information. I loved what Ann was saying about the Field to Streams booklet. I'll be looking at that later because we do our own version of some of that education and outreach, talking about the water cycle and how water moves and how, at least in the Zumbro, we've really changed how water moves through the system, which has some advantages but also has some disadvantages. So education programs, live programs at libraries. We do outreach and programs, educational programs. Sometimes there'll be a church organization or a community organization that wants to hear more about water issues, and I'll come in and give a talk, usually a PowerPoint lecture. We also have our ambassador, Zumbro Zoe. She's a 6-foot otter that spends most of her time swimming in the Zumbro, but every once in a while she comes out of the water and dries off and comes to do library programs with me or goes to community events. She'll be in parades and at booths and talks with kids about picking up litter and what they can do for clean water. And so Zumbro's always been a big hit. Along with that piece, we also did a survey a few years back in 2013 to look at how people want to hear information. And we found out that newspapers were an area where lots of people liked reading newspapers. They wanted to hear more information about rivers and water and clean water through the newspaper. And so we do a monthly newspaper article on some clean water river issue. And usually I interview local resource professionals, local landowners, on a certain topic. And this last month, we had a newspaper article about a survey that had just come out looking at the effectiveness of our current voluntary-only, no-regulation agriculture programs in Midwestern states. There was a study that sort of evaluated, we've done these programs for this many years, we spent this many dollars on it, what do we get for our money? And so I was able to use that study to see, how's it working and how does that apply to Minnesota. By interviewing some local resource professionals and farmers, we could say, is what this report says, is that true to you, or do you see something different happening in Minnesota? And so that's been a great outreach tool for us, is just that newspaper article process. And we also do public events. Every March for the last 2 years, we've done education programs in a city called Mazeppa. It's a small town north of Rochester. And we've done education programs in the middle of March is ideal because rural landowners and farmers have a little time off before they have to get in the field. And so we've done, last year it was ideal. We had a big panel discussion on the new proposed buffer rule. And it turned out that our panel showed up 3 days after the first proposal for legislation on the buffer rule. And so it was perfect timing that we had 100 people in the room that could look at what the legislation was proposing, and we had resource professionals and farm groups there to hold sort of an organized panel discussion about what buffers were, why they're important, and what's likely to happen with the legislature. And so we really enjoyed getting people into the room. That's really our big goal here as a nonprofit organization, is get the right people in the room so they can discuss some of these issues and then take steps to help deal with the pollution problems in Minnesota. Something that I'm not involved in education, but it's another wing of what we do. There's the One Watershed, One Plan idea coming from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, Bowser, and they seem to be moving toward the idea that rather than managing watersheds at the county level, which is great governmentally because counties have good borders, but is horrible water-wise because waters don't recognize county boundaries, that we want to be moving toward people managing watersheds at the watershed scale. And we've been getting people together to talk about that and moving that direction as well. Not part of what I do in education, but it's another thing that we do. How's that changed public engagement? That's a good question. We're planning on doing another survey in another year or two, and we're going to see how some of the questions that we came across in 2013, how those are answered differently now. And we'll see down the road. We don't have a lot of data yet, but people are at least starting to think about the questions a little more. The Zumbro River, and maybe this happens in a lot of rural areas, was really seen as sort of an invisible river. It wasn't heavily used for recreation. It wasn't seen as a tourist river, and so it was ignored in some ways, except for when it flooded, and then we had to do something about it. And so one thing that we're doing is just getting people aware of when they're crossing the river. 3 years ago, we did a big project to put education signs in a few parks to teach people about the river, sort of the precursor to this big project. We also put signs up on all of the county bridges that we could in the watershed. And that's had a huge impact. People have really noticed those signs and noticed that they're crossing a river that has a name. And it's really hard for people to care about a river if you don't know what the name of the river or stream is. And we've seen already increased awareness of people just knowing what river or stream they live on. And it's a little bit like, we tend to be a lot nicer to our neighbors than maybe to people while we're driving on the highway. And rivers are the same way. If you know a river, you know where it flows, you have a sense for where it goes, and maybe it goes through a park that you like visiting. You tend to think a little bit differently about that in terms of, you might be a little more invested in keeping the river clean because you know its name and where it flows. And so that's been something we've been working on. And Ann mentions the Red River Basin is nearly fully covered by strong watershed districts. Yeah, that's great. Those watershed districts have done a great job of working on their flooding issues there. They have very different problems than what we have here, but yeah, that's been a great project. Cool project, Kevin. This is an excellent example of supporting community ideas and energy with university resources. Excellent. Thanks. Thanks, Linda. Yeah, any other questions about the project? Looks like we're just about out of time here, too. So, Rose, should I hand you the ball?
Yeah, well, so I do want to keep inviting questions, but before people have to get going, I know it's getting close to noon. As part of my Conservation Corps and Serve Minnesota piece, I do have to take surveys to see how I'm doing and what impact I'm making in organizing these sorts of connections and other events. So I'm going to open up a poll here, and for those of you who are on WebEx, if you wouldn't mind filling in those two questions: how much did you learn, and what content was most interesting or most relevant to your work? When you close out of WebEx, you will also, I think, be directed to a larger survey, and that'll be used for directing our regional sustainable development projects and also for my work. So yeah, please let us know, and if you had feedback issues or audio issues, let me know what that was as well. That's included in the survey, and that survey, the longer one, will also be on the website. So yeah, go ahead and fill in the poll. I also wanted to share a few things. Let's see. There was a question on the website about the Governor's Water Summit. And let me just show you on our Google site where you can submit questions later. So this is the Natural Resource Webinar Series site. Episode 1 here is where we're at. And if you scroll down, there's a bit about our presenters. Thank you so much, both of you, for being patient and for sharing all your info. And then down here is a place for webinar questions, so you can enter a question or comment. And then down below here, it's a little bit cut off in the WebEx format on my screen, but it should list the questions that have been submitted, so you can also see what other people have asked. And we can try to put up links or answers on this web page here for those questions that come in later. One of the questions that came in was about the Governor's Water Summit that occurred on the 27th. I'll share a follow-up to that, which applies to everything that we've been talking about here, too. So here on the screen, you can hopefully see the Governor's Water Summit online public forum. And if you're not online right now, you can look that up later. But essentially, it's a really cool place where you can read about all these perspectives of other individuals around the state. And you can also comment and engage people in dialogue, can read what other people are saying. So it's a really cool way to continue this conversation on a larger scale, and also see what other people are doing and what other people are working on. I encourage you all to check that out. I see most people are finished with this poll here. Thank you so much for your input. And there was another question that came out on the website soon after I announced the topic for this presentation. I got a question from someone, and this is specifically directed to the fields and streams. They asked why the term soil health didn't come up as much in that document as they would have hoped. So my question to you guys, I guess, is how does soil health play into water health and how we use the water? Yeah, soil health relating to water health.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but we did. We do have a little chapter on soil, but yeah, we didn't dig into the soil health as much. And there's a little bit of reference to it in the part 2 on practices and crop management, or field management. Make a little reference to it. But.
Kevin, in your education, the education sites, is there any discussion on how the soil relates to water?
We actually, I was mentioning that those the last few Marches we've had events, and actually 2 Marches ago we had a Healthy Soil, Healthy Water event up in Mazeppa, where we had lots of resource professionals there, and actually we talked about that very issue. We had a soil scientist from the Natural Resource Conservation Service come in and show people different examples of soils and talk about how healthier soil, physically it's more similar to what the soil was with our prairies 150 years ago. And generally it's soil that sort of sticks together pretty well. It has lots of pores in it, or holes in it that absorb water and air, and lots of microorganisms. And so we've been talking about that more and more because we realized that farmers that do practices that lead to healthier soil, like no-till farming where you don't disturb the soil as much, those soils absorb a huge amount of rainwater compared to conventionally farmed soils that tend to be really compact and don't have many organisms in them. And so probably over the last 3 years, we've been talking more and more about soil health just because it's a lot of times when we talk about clean water, the practices that we're talking about are we're asking farmers to give up something, give up land for buffers, or give up land for strip crops, or other practices that reduce their income in some ways. But soil health is a practice that when farmers engage in it, they can still farm all the acres they've been farming, but they farm it in a better way so that it has less impact on the river. And so we've been really talking more and more about that. And just the last year or so, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has caught up with us and is now really promoting soil health, which is great to hear. They've been doing it in the past too, but now they've got all kinds of brochures and they've been really pushing that piece of it. The only challenge that we run into, though, is, of course, voluntary practice. So, you know, some farmers are doing it, which is great, but it's not enough yet that we're seeing cleaner water because we haven't got quite enough farmers doing it.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Thank you. Lots of potential there, I think, for more education and implementation. Thank you guys again for presenting. I think that wraps up the questions that I've seen, but I wanted to remind everyone again of those 2 questions that Anne posed for us from the Water Resources Center. What are your topics that you're concerned with, and what expertise do you need, and how can the Water Resources Center and the RSDPs and everyone stay more in touch with what your needs are? So I'm going to put those questions on the webpage as well. Feel free to send in answers to those. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Rose.
Thanks, Rose.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. And tune in 2 weeks, 11 a.m. I think that our next presenter will be Dean Current, who, Dean, I saw you on the attendee list here, and we'll be talking about SINRAM. So thanks, everyone, for coming. All right, I'll go ahead and end the event. See you next time.
Okay, thanks.